He heard everything. She thought silence was safe. Neither of them was right. The bullet found him at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, which was, by any measure, an inconvenient time to die. Raphael Conti had been walking from the private elevator of Club Nero, his club, his empire in neon and shadow, toward the black Escalade idling at the curb with its engine breathing low like a predator at rest. He'd had 3 glasses of Barolo and one conversation he wished he could unhave, and his mind was already moving ahead to Rome, to the meeting at dawn with the Ferretti family, to the particular way the Mediterranean light hit the Colosseum at 6 in the morning, when the city still belonged to pigeons and ghosts, and men like him. He didn't hear the shot. He never did, the way soldiers who survive never hear the one that finds them. There was simply a pressure, enormous, absolute, in his chest, below the left shoulder, and then the world tilted. The cobblestones of the Brickell alley rose up to meet him with an almost gentle inevitability, as if they had been waiting for him his whole life. He heard Marco shouting. He heard the Escalade's tires tear the air. He heard, distantly, the sound of running feet, and then silence. A silence so complete it had texture, had weight, had temperature. It was warm. Strange, he thought, as the blood moved through his shirt in the dark. I always imagined death would be cold. But it was warm, and it smelled like motor oil and gardenias. Someone had planted gardenias in a terracotta pot by the alley's service entrance, some optimistic act of beauty in the middle of a place that had seen ugly things. And Raphael Conti, who had never been moved by beauty in his 41 years of living, found himself, in dying, obscurely grateful for it. He didn't die. That was the first surprise. Miami General's trauma unit received him at 12:19 a.m. with a GSW to the left thoracic cavity, a secondary fragment wound at the temple from where his head had struck the curb, and a blood pressure that the attending physician, Dr. Yusuf Okafor, later described in his notes as incompatible with continued consciousness. The bullet had missed his heart by 11 millimeters. The temple strike had caused a subdural hematoma that pressed on the brainstem with the patience of a debt collector. They opened him on the table, removed the bullet, drained the hematoma, rebuilt what could be rebuilt, and wheeled him into the ICU at 3:47 a.m. with a breathing tube down his throat and machines doing the work his body had temporarily resigned from. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Patricia Ruiz, who had treated 3 other men from the Conti organization over the years and had the good sense never to comment on that pattern, told Marco Esposito in the family waiting room that Mr. Conti was in a medically induced coma, that they would attempt to lighten sedation in 48 to 72 hours, and that the outcome was, at this juncture, uncertain. Marco, who was 43 and had been at Raphael's side since they were running numbers for Raphael's father in Little Havana at the age of 14, said nothing. He sat in the plastic chair with his hands between his knees and his jaw set like concrete, and he did not move for 6 hours. The men from the organization arrived in careful intervals, never more than 2 at a time, never visibly armed, never staying long, and the hospital's administration had been quietly, generously persuaded that the ICU required a security arrangement that departed somewhat from standard protocols. A private room, no visitor logs, no names on the door. By morning, Raphael Conti occupied room 14C as though he had always been there, as though the room had been waiting for him, with his machines breathing and his empire paused, and his enemies, whoever they were, not yet certain they had finished the job. Chloe Marchetti had been a resuscitation nurse for 7 years. She had started in the general ICU at 24, moved to the trauma unit at 26, and had developed, in the years since, a particular competency in comatose patients, in the specific discipline of maintaining the body of someone who was, in every meaningful sense, absent. She was good at it. She was, her supervisor Diane had told her once with a mixture of admiration and mild concern, too good at it, too present with them, too inclined to speak to them as though they might answer. "They can hear more than we think," Chloe had replied, which was not quite a medical claim and not quite not one, and Diane had let it go. She was 31, and she lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Coconut Grove with a cat named Dostoevsky, who ignored her, and a bookshelf that had outgrown its wall, and an ex-boyfriend named Daniel, whose name she tried not to say aloud because the sound of it still did something unpleasant to her sternum. She worked 4 12-hour shifts a week and spent her days off at the farmer's market and in long walks along the bay, and occasionally at a quiet bar called The Fig, where she drank 1 glass of wine and read and spoke to no one and felt, in that solitude, something that was almost peace. She was not, she would have told you, the kind of woman who fell into things. She was careful. She was deliberate. She had learned, over years of watching people not come back, to hold loosely to everything. She came on shift at 6 in the morning on the Friday they brought Raphael Conti in, and by 9 she had been assigned to room 14C. Diane had told her only that the patient was a private admission, high profile, that discretion was required, and that the security arrangement was to be respected without question. Chloe had worked Miami General long enough to understand what that meant. It meant the man in the bed had money, or power, or both, and that the hospital had made a calculation, and that her job was to keep him alive while that calculation played out. She pushed open the door of 14C at 9:04 a.m. and stood at the threshold for 1 full second before entering. She had expected something diminished. Coma reduced everyone. It stripped the performance from people, left only the substrate, the basic animal machinery of respiration and circulation and neural static. She had cared for CEOs and teenagers and old women and young men, and they were all, in the end, the same underneath. Dependent, unguarded, reduced. The man in the bed was not reduced. He was, even supine, even tubed, even in the thin blue hospital gown that was nobody's best look, formidable. That was the word her mind reached for and held. He was tall. She could see that, even prone. The jaw was sharp, the cheekbones cut, the dark hair pushed back from a face that was, underneath the pallor of blood loss and the bruising from the temple strike, beautiful in the particular way that dangerous things were beautiful, the way a storm was beautiful, or a predator caught in the moment before it moved. The machines recorded his absence. His chest rose and fell with ventilator precision. He was not there. She crossed to the bed and began her assessment with the routine she had done 1,000 times, her hands moving with the efficient tenderness she gave all her patients, checking the lines, the drips, the pressure readings, the temperature, the subtle signs of distress that the machines measured and the nurses interpreted. She wrote her first notes. She adjusted the angle of the bed. She checked his pupils with her penlight, fixed, equal, sluggishly reactive, which was an improvement over admission, and noted it. Then she did the thing that was half habit, half conviction and entirely her own. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down, and she said, "Good morning, mister." She glanced at the admitting chart's single, sparse line. "Mr. R. That's all they gave me. I'll call you R for now. My name is Chloe. I'm your nurse. I'm going to take very good care of you. I want you to know that." The machines hummed. R did not respond. "Your vitals are stabilizing," she continued, in the same steady, conversational tone. "Your blood pressure is better this morning than it was at admission. That's you fighting. That's a good sign. Keep doing that." She had no idea why she'd started talking to them. It had begun in her second year, with an elderly Italian man named Cosimo, who had been in a medically induced coma for 11 days following open-heart surgery, and who had emerged from it somehow knowing, that she had read him the entirety of the first canto of the Inferno during her overnight shifts, because she'd found a battered paperback copy in the break room, and it had seemed, at 3 in the morning, like the right company for both of them. He had told her, when he could speak, that he had heard her, that her voice had been a rope, that he had held on to it. She had never stopped. By the end of the first week, she knew the cadences of his machines the way you knew the sounds of a familiar house. She knew when his pressure dipped in the early afternoon, when his heart rate spiked slightly, inexplicably, around 2 a.m., when his colour was better and when it was thinner, the translucent quality that meant his body was working harder than it should. By the end of the first week, she also knew, from the men outside the door, from the careful silence when questions were asked, from the quality of the flowers that arrived daily, white gardenias always, placed by Marco without explanation, that R was not a civilian. She knew what the men in expensive suits with watchful eyes meant. She had grown up in this city. Her father had driven a cab in Little Havana for 30 years, and he had a particular look he wore when men like these walked past. A look that was not exactly fear and not exactly respect, but was something carved from both. She recognized it because she had seen it on his face her whole childhood. She cared for R anyway. She would have cared for the devil himself if someone laid him in her bed and put him in her charge, because that was what nursing was, the absence of judgment at the bedside. The body was the body, the breath was the breath. You kept both going, and you let the rest be someone else's problem. But she talked to him. She talked to him the way she talked to all of them, but differently too, with more curiosity, she would later admit. He was a puzzle. He had no family on record, no next of kin, just Marco, who arrived every day at noon and sat in the plastic chair with the kind of loyalty that had no modern vocabulary for it, and left at 4 without touching anything. "You have someone who loves you," she told R on the 6th day, during the afternoon lull when the floor was quiet and the gardenias on the window ledge were heavy and the Miami sky outside the window was going amber. "That man who comes every day. He never says anything. He just comes. I think that's the truest kind." The ventilator breathed. His chest rose and fell. "I don't have that," she said, and was surprised by the candour of it. "I have a cat who tolerates me, and a book collection that's getting out of hand." She paused. "And a mother in Fort Lauderdale, who calls every Sunday and asks when I'm going to find someone, as if I'm not looking, as if looking were the problem." She caught herself, sat back, looked at the ceiling and laughed softly, a small, private sound. "You're very easy to talk to, you know, in this particular state." The medically induced coma ended on day 7. The natural one continued. Dr. Ruiz had used the phrase prolonged disorders of consciousness in her notes, which was the clinical way of saying that Rafael Conti's brain was doing something the medicine could not fully account for. The hematoma was resolved. The swelling was down. The bullet's damage was repaired. And yet the brain, which had its own schedule and its own logic, had not returned the occupant to the building. Sometimes, Dr. Ruiz told Marco, the brain needs time. There's evidence of activity. He's not absent. He's just choosing. Marco had stared at her with his weathered face and said quietly, "He doesn't choose anything halfway." She had not known how to respond to that. Chloe had, in her 7 years, cared for patients in prolonged comas for up to 3 months. She knew the arc of it, the first days of acute crisis, the stabilization, the long middle passage that was all maintenance and watching and waiting, and then either the awakening or the absence that became permanent. She knew the statistics. She didn't share them. With R, the long middle passage began on day 8, and she settled into it with the particular discipline of a woman who knew how to wait without wasting. She talked to him every shift. It started as professional habit, orientation, reassurance, the clinical case for auditory stimulation in consciousness recovery. There was literature on it, real literature. Studies suggesting that familiar voices and meaningful speech could accelerate arousal in comatose patients. She had the literature. She believed it. But by the 2nd week, it had become something else. Something that felt, if she were being completely honest with herself, and she was, in this room with this silent man, like confession. She had never been to confession in her adult life. Her grandmother had dragged her through the ritual as a child, and she had sat in the dark booth with her list of small sins and felt only the strangeness of it, the peculiar intimacy of speaking in the dark to something you couldn't see. She hadn't understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. "My ex-boyfriend was named Daniel," she said on day 9, adjusting his IV and not looking at his face while she spoke. "We were together for 3 years. He was kind, which I think was the problem. I'm better with problems I can fix than with kindness I can't deserve. That's a terrible thing to know about yourself." His blood pressure held steady at 118/74. The machines recorded her words as silence. He wanted to get married. He used the word soulmate, and I left. Not that night. I was polite about it. I took 2 weeks, and I made it organized, and I told him it was about my career, about not being ready, and all of it was true, and none of it was the truth. The truth was that the word soulmate frightened me in a way I couldn't explain to someone who believed in souls. She finished the IV check. She sat in the chair. "Do you believe in souls?" she asked R. "I think you might. Italians usually do. Even the ones who—" She stopped. "Even the complicated ones." On day 12, Marco arrived at his usual noon hour, and Chloe happened to be in the room, adjusting the angle of the bed. They had developed a quiet professional détente. He nodded, she gave him a brief summary of the night's readings, and then left him alone with Raphael for his 4 hours of silent vigil. That day he didn't take the usual chair. He stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, looking at Raphael with an expression that was the closest Chloe had ever seen to grief on a man who seemed to have been specifically constructed to resist it. "He's going to be angry when he wakes up," Marco said. Not to Chloe, not exactly, just said into the room. He hates being still. That's actually a good sign, Chloe said. Strong will. People with strong wills, they tend to find their way back. Marco looked at her for the first time with something other than professional neutrality. You believe that? I do. Why? She thought about it. Because I've watched it. 40-odd times now, over 7 years. The ones who wake up, they're usually the ones who have something unfinished. Something they're still arguing with. The ones who, she paused, don't. They tend to be at peace, and he doesn't look at peace. Marco looked at Raphael again. Something moved in his jaw. No, he agreed. He doesn't. After he left, Chloe returned to the room for the evening vitals and found that the gardenias had been changed, fresh white blooms, their scent filling the small room with something that was almost overwhelming. He brought you gardenias again, she told Raphael. He must have a thing for them. Or he does. Either way, the room smells like someone's grandmother's garden in the best possible way. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the machines. Mine grew tomatoes, she said. My nonna. In the back of a house in Fort Lauderdale, in the worst possible soil for tomatoes, and somehow she got them to cooperate. She said the secret was talking to them. She said everything grows better when it knows someone's paying attention. She looked at his face, still remote, unreachable. I think she might have been right. On day 14, there was trouble. It came in the form of 2 men Chloe didn't recognize, not Marco's careful, silent associates, but different men, sharper and less disciplined, who appeared at the nurse's station asking for the room number of a patient admitted the previous week, giving a name that was not the name on the non-existent chart. The floor supervisor called security. The men left. Chloe said nothing to Marco when he arrived, but that night, sitting in the chair in room 14C, after her 4th vitals check, she felt the weight of what she was in the middle of. Truly felt it, in the chest. And she sat with it for a while, in the dark. Someone tried to find you today, she told R quietly. 2 men. They didn't get past the nurse's station. She was quiet. I'm not going to ask you what that means. I think I already know what that means. And I don't, she breathed. I don't care what you've done. I want to be clear about that. Not because I don't have a conscience, but because, she pressed her lips together, because you're breathing, you're here, and my job is here. The rest of it isn't mine to judge. She reached over and adjusted the drip. Her hand was, she noticed, entirely steady. But whoever they were, she said, they're not getting in here. I can promise you that. She didn't know why she said it. She didn't know why the saying of it made her feel better. On day 21, she told him about Rome. She had been once, the summer after nursing school, a reward to herself, 2 weeks with a college friend who had since moved to Barcelona and out of her life in the gradual way that adult friendships moved. She had eaten her weight in cacio e pepe and sat on the Spanish steps at midnight and stood in the Pantheon and felt for the first time in her very practical life that the world was old in a way that made her own problems appropriately small. The Pantheon, she said, with a feeling she couldn't quite categorize, does something to you. The way it's open to the sky, the way it just accepts the weather, rain, sun, whatever. It just stays there and takes it, and the dome curves overhead, and you're standing in something that's been standing for 2,000 years, and you realize you're extremely temporary, and somehow that's... She stopped. Not sad. It's a relief. to be temporary. She looked at his face, the slight furrow of his brow which had appeared around day 18 and which Dr. Ruiz said was consistent with increased subcortical activity, was there, and in the amber afternoon light it made him look, she thought, like a man working on a difficult problem in his sleep. "Were you born there?" she asked. "Or here? Both, maybe. You look like both." She tilted her head. "You have Miami in the jaw, something about the jaw, and Rome everywhere else." She was quiet for a while. "I'd like to go back," she said, "to Rome, when I'm less—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Someday." On day 23, she made the mistake of bringing her notebook. She had kept a journal since she was 14. Not the confessional kind, but the observational kind. The kind where you wrote down what the light looked like and what someone said that surprised you and what a certain street smelled like in the rain. She had volumes of them on a shelf in her apartment, packed in chronological order, and she had the current one in her bag because she'd been carrying it everywhere since the terrible habit had started of writing down patient observations in it during long overnight shifts. She pulled it out during a quiet hour at 3 a.m. and wrote, "Day 23. He's still. The furrow is deeper tonight. Whatever he's working on in there, it's complicated. Vitals strong, blood pressure 122/78, heart rate 58. Still athletic even here. Even like this. Gardenia on the window has 3 new blooms. The nighttime smell of gardenias is different from the daytime smell. More private." She paused. Then, "I told him about Rome today. About the Pantheon. I don't know why I tell him things. It's like speaking into a well. You hear yourself differently." She read that last sentence back, crossed it out, wrote it again. You hear yourself differently. She had not told Daniel about the Pantheon. She had tried when she came back from that trip, and he had listened with the polite attention of a man who has never been moved by a building and cannot quite conceive of being so. And she had stopped trying. She had that memory sealed inside her like a jar. The feeling of standing under the oculus, the rain coming straight down through the open eye of the dome, wetting the ancient floor in a perfect circle. And she had kept it to herself because there had been no one to give it to. Until a man in a coma, in a hospital room in Miami. "I think," she said aloud, setting the notebook on her knee, "that I've been lonely for a very long time. Is that—" she laughed softly, "is that something you understand? You have Marco. You have people who would die for you. I can see that much. But do you have someone you can tell things to?" The machines hummed. "I don't think powerful men usually do," she said. "I think power is a very particular kind of loneliness. You can't let anyone close enough to have the information. And information is intimacy. That's what I've learned in this job. Not touch, not proximity, information. When someone tells you the true thing, the thing underneath the performance, that's when you're close to them." She was quiet for a moment. "So in a way," she said, and there was something wry and slightly resigned in her voice, "you know me better than anyone, which is either the most intimate thing I've ever experienced or the safest relationship I've ever had, possibly both." On day 25, Marco arrived and, for the first time, stayed past 4. He was still there when Chloe came for the 6 p.m. vitals, sitting in the plastic chair with a glass of water that had gone warm and his phone face down on his knee, looking at Raphael with an expression that had moved past grief into something more like duty. Chloe did her work quietly, aware of him in the way you were aware of someone who was not quite in the room with you, present, but somewhere else. "He's been in comas before," Marco said, without preamble. She looked up. "Medically induced?" "Once, 5 years ago. Surgery in Rome. A situation." He paused. "He came out of it in 4 days. He doesn't usually stay down." "Everyone's different," Chloe said. "The brain does what the brain needs to do. The best thing we can do is give it the conditions to recover and wait." "He doesn't like waiting." "I know. You've mentioned." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed Marco's face. "He's going to be very difficult when he wakes up." "They all are," she said. 40 days of doing nothing, and then suddenly they're back in the body, and the body has opinions about it. It's disorienting. But the anger usually means they're fully back." She moved to the window, checked the gardenia, moved a bloom that had dropped. "He likes gardenias," Marco said. She turned. "He told you that?" "His mother grew them, in their house in Cuba. His father's side is Cuban, his mother Italian. She had a garden." Marco looked at the flower. "He doesn't talk about it, but he brings them to every place he lives, has the staff plant them, first thing." Chloe looked at the white blooms in the late afternoon light, at the man in the bed beneath them. "He's more sentimental than he seems," she said. "He would shoot you for saying that." "Good thing he's asleep." Marco looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, the way no one had in a while, with a measuring attention that wasn't intimidating so much as thorough. Then he said, "You're different." "Different from what?" "The other nurses. You talk to him." She held his gaze. "Is that a problem?" "No," Marco said, and something in the word was definitive, in a way that meant she understood it had been considered, not just said. "No, I think—" He looked at Raphael. "I think it's why he's still here." She didn't say anything to that, but she thought about it for a long time, walking the corridor to her next patient, and again in the break room over bad coffee, and again during the long 3 to 6 a.m. stretch when the hospital breathed slowly, and she sat in room 14C in the blue dark and told the silent man things she'd never told anyone. On day 27, she told him about her father. Giuseppe Marchetti, who had driven a cab in this city for 30 years and died of a stroke in his cab on a Tuesday morning in November, which Chloe had always thought was both the most terrible and the most fitting death for him. Mid-motion, still going somewhere, still in service. He had been 59. She had been 22, still in nursing school, the youngest of 3 children, and the one most like him, the one who got his stubbornness and his habit of saying too much when he was tired and too little when it mattered. "He never told me he loved me," she said, "not in words. He said it—" She thought about how to say this. "He said it in other languages. He fixed my bicycle. He drove 3 hours to bring me food when I had the flu in my first year of nursing school. He left the light on, always." She stopped. "He left the light on when I came home late. Even when I was an adult, even when it was past 2 in the morning and the apartment was dark except for the kitchen light. It was always on." She was quiet for a long time. "That's love," she said, "the light being on. I keep looking for that in people and—" She shook her head. "Daniel turned off the light to save electricity. That should have told me everything. The monitors recorded his vital signs. Steady, steady, steady. "Do you leave lights on?" she asked. She wasn't expecting an answer. She never was. But on day 27, for the first time, something changed. His hand moved. It was slight, the smallest contraction of the fingers, a muscle impulse, possibly autonomic, possibly nothing. She was at his side immediately, her training overriding everything else, her hand on his, her voice close. "Ah, can you hear me? Can you squeeze my hand?" Nothing. She sat back, breathed, made the notation in the chart, called Dr. Ruiz's service. But she sat there for the rest of her shift, with her heart doing something she would not categorize. And when she wrote in her notebook at 6 a.m., she only wrote, "His hand moved." It probably meant nothing. It didn't feel like nothing. He was not gone. This is important to understand. He was not gone. He was in the underneath. That was the only word he had for it, lying in the dark of himself, in the place where the body continued its mechanical insistence on existence, and the mind drifted in something that was not sleep and not waking, but the narrow corridor between them, where sensation arrived partially and distantly, like music through walls. He felt the tubes, the weight of the machines, the periodic cool of the IV line and the pressure of the cuff, and the strange, precise touch of hands that moved over him with professional confidence, checking, measuring, adjusting. He felt Marco's presence as a particular quality of stillness on his left side. He felt the warmth from the window in the afternoons. And he heard her. He heard her voice before he understood what it was saying. Before the words had meaning, the voice had meaning. It was measured and low and warm without performing warmth, the way certain lights were warm, not demonstratively, not asking you to notice, just intrinsically, as a property of what they were. It had what he would later think of, though he lacked the language for it at the time, as intelligence. You could hear it thinking as it spoke. The early days were fragments. "My name is Chloe. I'm your nurse. I'm going to take very good care of you. Keep doing that. You have someone who loves you." He heard these things the way you heard music in a dream, present and meaningful, but not quite attached to the world you knew. But the voice returned. It returned every day, and the return of it was, he didn't have a word for it. He had never been the kind of man who had a word for it. It was simply that when she was there, in the room, the underneath was less dark. On day 9, he would count the days later, count them backward from what he could reconstruct. She said something about a man named Daniel. "I'm better with problems I can fix than with kindness I can't deserve." He did not know why that sentence reached him when so many others had drifted past. He lay in the dark of himself and held it, turned it over. The cadence of it, the precision. She had thought about this before saying it. You could hear the weight of the thinking in the space before the words. She was not a woman who said things carelessly. He tried to respond. He could not move. He was a mind in a box, and the box was not yet his. But he listened. God help him, he listened. By the second week, he was beginning to reconstruct her, piece by piece, in the dark, from everything she said and didn't say. The voice first, then the rhythms of her, the slight acceleration when she was being honest about something difficult, the pause before she said anything true, the laugh that was low and surprised and always directed at herself, never at anything outside her, the laugh of a woman who did not take herself seriously enough. She talked about her father, and he learned that she loved and had lost. She talked about Rome, and he learned that she could be moved. She talked about her cat named Dostoevsky, and he learned that she had a specific kind of humour that required you to be paying attention to catch it. She talked about loneliness, and he learned that she carried it the way only people who have learned to carry it alone do, without complaint, without asking to put it down. In a way, you know me better than anyone. He heard that on day 25, or 26. The days were less distinct in the underneath. They had a quality of flowing together, one continuous long moment punctuated by her voice. He heard it, and something in the underneath shifted, something in whatever he was while he was not himself. He had known many women. This was not a thing he was proud of or ashamed of. It was simply true, the way certain facts about a person's life are simply true and carry no moral weight in either direction. He had known beautiful women, educated women, women who wanted power adjacent to his, and women who wanted the protection of it, and women who had come to him out of some more complicated appetite that he respected more than the others. He had been desired and pursued, and occasionally something that resembled beloved. He had not been known. You know me better than anyone. In the dark of himself, Raphael Conti understood, with the particular clarity that the underneath gave to things, stripping them of the noise of action and choice, that he did not know what this was. He did not have a category for it. A woman he had never seen, whose face was a blank to him, whose hands on him had been always professional, never anything else, whose voice was everything. Just the voice, and the knowledge that she gave it freely, without agenda, because she thought he couldn't hear. Because she thought he couldn't hear. He was going to remember everything. On day 27, she was crying. He knew it before she spoke. There was a quality to her silence when she arrived that night that was different. A weight to the air around her, a stillness in her movements that cost her more than usual. He didn't know what had happened. She didn't say, not immediately. She did his vitals in silence, and then she sat in the chair, and she was very quiet for a long time. "Sorry," she said finally. It's been a day," she breathed. "One of my other patients, I had a patient, Mrs. Andreu, on the 3rd floor. She'd been with us for 6 weeks. She stopped. She died this morning, that's the job. I know that's the job. It doesn't—" She stopped again. "It doesn't get easier," she said. "They tell you in school that it gets easier. They mean the process gets more familiar. The grief doesn't." He lay in the underneath and listened to her grieve a woman he didn't know, in the small hours of a Miami night, alone in a room with a man who could not reach her. He tried. For the first time, he truly tried, pushed against the wall of his own stillness with everything he had, tried to give her the only thing he had, which was the movement of his hand. He felt the slight contraction. He heard the sharp intake of her breath. "Ah," she said, and his name, not his name, but hers for him, had something in it he had no word for. "Can you hear me? Can you squeeze my hand?" He could not. He had spent everything he had on that small movement, and the underneath closed back around him. But he heard her breathing change. He heard her write in something, her notebook, he suspected, which she had mentioned once, and which he had filed as a detail about her. He heard her sit with him for the rest of her shift, and when she spoke again at 5:30 in the morning, her voice was steadier. "I'm going to make it through this," she said. "Both of us are." He believed her. Chloe did not tell anyone about the way she talked to him. This was not unusual. She didn't tell anyone about any of her patients, not because she lacked people to tell, but because the room was, she had always felt, private. Whatever happened between her and her patients in those long shifts was theirs. It was sealed in the particular way that sacred things were sealed, not with rules, but with something more fundamental, an understanding that some spaces didn't export. But she was aware, somewhere around week 3, that what was happening in room 14C was different in ways she hadn't fully mapped. She thought about him outside the hospital. That was new. She had thought about patients before, worried about them, carried the unresolved cases with her on long walks along the bay, but this was different. She thought about his face in the morning when she was making coffee. She thought about what Marco had said. He's going to be difficult when he wakes up, and found herself smiling at the counter in her kitchen. She thought about his hand moving on day 27 and felt, again and again, the precise weight of that small gesture in her chest. She was a medical professional. She knew about transference. She knew about the particular kind of attachment that formed when you were the sole witness to someone's most vulnerable state, when you were the one keeping them in the world. She knew the name for what this might be, and she applied it cleanly and set it aside. And then she went to work and sat in the chair and started talking. On day 29, she described him to herself. Not to him, to herself, as if taking inventory of something she would need to give back eventually, and wanted to know she'd looked carefully. She was doing his morning assessment, and her mind was running its own parallel track, the way minds do. The jaw she had already catalogued, the dark hair that Marco had someone come in to keep trimmed, which was, she thought, either an extraordinary level of loyalty or the most Italian thing she had ever witnessed, or possibly both. The hands. She had noticed the hands on day 3, large, scarred at the knuckles, in the way that told a particular kind of story, a story she didn't need to read to know the genre of. The mouth was... She didn't catalogue the mouth. She moved past it. The body was tall and lean, in the specific way of a man who was physically active, not from vanity, but from some more fundamental discipline, the kind of fitness that was a byproduct of a life that required it, rather than a life organised around the gym. He had 3 scars she had mapped. One across the left side of the rib cage, healed long ago, one on the inner right forearm, surgical, one on the right shoulder blade, which was old and could have been anything. He had, she thought, lived at a particular velocity, and she had her 1-bedroom in Coconut Grove, and her cat, and her farmer's market Saturdays, and her quiet bar with her single glass of wine. She tried to imagine them in the same room, awake, both of them, in the ordinary world, and the image failed to assemble itself. He was from a different taxonomy of existence, not worse than hers, not better, but oriented differently, built for different pressures. She finished the assessment and wrote her notes, and did not write any of what she'd just been thinking. Instead, she said, "I've been thinking about what you might be like. Awake. I think you'd be..." She tilted her head. "I think you'd be very quiet. In the way that people are quiet when they don't need to fill space, because they know the space belongs to them. I've met people like that. They're usually the most dangerous people in the room." She picked up her notebook, set it down. "I'm not afraid of dangerous," she said. "I work in a trauma unit. Danger, I understand. It's the—" She stopped. "It's the kindness I can't handle. The men who look at you like you're the solution to a problem they've been working on for years. That's what I can't." She stopped again, laughed at herself. "What are you going to do about it anyway? You're asleep." Marco, on day 30, brought coffee. He brought 2 cups, the good kind, from the Cuban place 3 blocks from the hospital that made it in the way that made Chloe understand, the first time she'd had it, why people in this city would drive across town for coffee. He set 1 cup on the nurse's station counter without explanation and took the other into room 14C. And Chloe stood at the station and looked at the cup for a moment before picking it up. It was the kind of gesture that had no language attached to it. It wasn't a thank you, exactly. It wasn't acknowledgement. It was simpler than that. It was the cup being put down. She thought about what she'd said to R, the light being on, always. She drank the coffee and thought that maybe she read signals better than she'd given herself credit for. After his 4-hour visit, Marco paused at the door of the room on his way out, which was new. He usually left without ceremony, and said, without turning, "His name is Raphael." She looked at him. "I thought you should know," Marco said, and left. She went back into the room and looked at the man in the bed for a long moment. The white gardenias, the machines, the afternoon light falling across the sharp geometry of his face. "Raphael," she said, testing it. It was heavy in the mouth. It had weight and history. It sounded like something carved from stone. "That's a very serious name," she said. "I should have guessed." On day 33, she read to him. She had brought the Inferno, not the battered break-room paperback that had started everything with old Cosimo years ago, but her own copy, which had her marginalia in the margins, small asterisks and underlinings, and in 1 or 2 places words she'd written in pencil. Yes, and how, and this. She read from the first canto, Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, in Italian that her grandmother had taught her, and nursing school had done its best to erode. And she read it imperfectly, with the wrong emphases and the occasional pause to puzzle out the syntax, but she read it aloud, and the room held the sound of it. She got 3 cantos in before she stopped. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," she said, in English, the most famous line. I've always thought that was the cruelest sign ever written, or the most honest. I can't decide. She looked at his face. "What do you think?" The slight furrow, the even breathing. "I think," she said slowly, "that it depends on whether you believe hope is the thing keeping you there, or the thing that gets you out." She closed the book, set it on the window ledge beside the gardenias. "I think you believe it gets you out," she said. "I can tell by the way you're still here." He came back on day 40. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was so quiet that Chloe, who was charting at the small desk by the window, almost missed it. There was a change in his breathing, a slight irregularity, not distress, but volition, the unmistakable quality of breath that was being chosen rather than administered. And then a sound from his throat, low and rough from 33 days of the ventilator, and she was at his side before she had consciously decided to move. His eyes were opening, not all the way, not with any speed. They opened the way the light came up in winter, slowly, against resistance. as if the darkness had to be persuaded to let go. The lashes moved, the lids parted, and then, for the first time, she saw his eyes. Dark, nearly black, focused despite everything, with an intensity that her training told her was remarkable, that she had never, in 7 years, seen in someone emerging from a prolonged coma. Most of them opened their eyes on emptiness, on confusion, on the blank reboot of consciousness that looked for all the world like a computer starting up. They were absent at first, gathering. He was not absent. He was there, fully there, looking at her. She held his gaze and said, calmly, because calm was what the moment needed, "Raphael, welcome back. My name is Chloe. You're in Miami General. You've been here 40 days. You're safe." She watched him process this. The eyes moved, taking in the room, the machines, the window with the gardenias. She saw it, the moment he registered the gardenias. Something moved in his face that she couldn't name, and then returned to her. She reached for the call button. "I'm going to call the doctor now. She'll—" His hand moved. His hand closed around her wrist, not hard, not demanding, just closed. A fact, a statement in the language of contact. Not yet. She looked down at his hand around her wrist, at the scars, at the knuckles, at the absolute certainty of the grip. She looked back at his face. "Okay," she said. "Okay. She's coming. I just—" She steadied herself. "How do you feel?" He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. His voice came out wrecked and ragged and barely audible. "Thirsty." She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together and reached for the water with her free hand, angling the straw, and he drank in small, careful amounts that she regulated, because the instinct to drink more than the throat could handle after this long was real, and she had learned that lesson on someone else. His hand stayed on her wrist the whole time. When she took the water away, he lay back against the pillow. Exhausted, she could see it, the effort of 30 seconds of consciousness visible in every line of him. But his eyes stayed on her. He didn't close them. He looked at her with the same absolute, unflinching attention that had no polite frame, that was simply what it was, and she felt it the way she felt weather, as something that was happening to her from outside, something she had no real recourse against. "You're going to be all right," she told him. Something moved in his face. His thumb, she registered this only afterward, reconstructing it, moved once across the inside of her wrist. Once, deliberate, before he released her. She stepped back, called the team, did her job, and later, much later, she stood in the break room and looked at the inside of her wrist and thought, that was nothing. That was a man emerging from a coma. That was reflex. She would be the first to admit, not entirely convincing. Doctor. Ruiz came within 8 minutes. The team followed. The room filled with the controlled choreography of a complex patient regaining consciousness, all of which Chloe managed from the periphery once the primary nursing had been handed off to the incoming team. Assessments, pupils, motor response, speech function. Raphael Conti was, according to every metric they could apply in those first 2 hours, completely intact. Dr. Ruiz, who had seen many things in 20 years, described him afterward as the clearest I've ever seen anyone emerge from a 40-day coma. "What do you mean by clear?" the resident asked. "I mean he answered every question. Dates, names, recent history, identity, all of it. No gaps, no confusion." She paused. He knew everything. Marco arrived at 1:15 p.m., 4 minutes after the call, which meant he had been, in some sense, waiting. And there was a scene in room 14C that Chloe was not present for, but that she was told later by the overnight nurse who had been doing the adjacent check, involved Marco Esposito sitting in the plastic chair with his face in his hands for approximately 45 seconds. 45 seconds of something that no one would call what it was, not to his face. And then he lifted his head, and he was whatever he was again, and the two of them talked in low voices for 2 hours while the machines were gradually removed and the world outside the room went on. Chloe completed her shift. She filed her final notes on Raphael Conti as a comatose patient. Vitals stable, patient regained consciousness, care transitioned to day team. And she was professional and thorough and correct. At the nurse's station, at the end of her shift, she picked up her bag. Her notebook was inside it. She held the bag strap with both hands for a moment. She realized she had thought, in some pocket of her mind she hadn't examined, that when he woke up, that would be it. That would be the end of it. The 40 days would close over like water, and she would go back to her life, and he would go back to his, and the things she had said in that room would stay there, sealed in the way that sacred things were sealed. She believed this. She wanted to believe this. She walked out of the hospital into the Miami afternoon. The heat hit her like a wall, humid and full, the sky too blue to be real, and she walked to her car and sat in it for a moment. The inside of her wrist. She put the car in drive and went home. 3 days later, he asked for her. She was not on his care team anymore. His status had shifted from ICU to step-down to private suite, which was not a standard hospital suite, but an entire floor secured for him, because once Raphael Conti was conscious and oriented, the logistical footprint of his existence reorganized accordingly. 3 days, and the floor outside his room had the subtle architecture of a command center. Suits, electronics. 2 men she recognized from the alley's surveillance reports that security had quietly shared with the charge nurses. She was walking past the corridor when Dr. Ruiz fell into step beside her. "He's asking for you specifically," Ruiz said without preamble. Chloe looked at her. "He doesn't know me. He asked for the nurse with the brown hair who talked to him." His words. Ruiz paused. "You're the only one who fits." There was a silence. "You don't have to," Ruiz said. "He's not your patient anymore." "I know. But you want to go." She didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. She went. The suite smelt different from room 14C. Still gardenias. Marco had relocated the plant, but overlaid now with coffee and the faint, expensive quality of clothing that costs more than it should, and electronics recently unpacked. The room had been transformed by the people in it, from a hospital room into something that was briefly, powerfully his. He was sitting up in the bed when she entered. The ventilator was gone. The lines were down to a single IV. His colour was better, still the pallor of the recently returned, but underneath it the Mediterranean warmth of his skin tone was reasserting itself. And in the afternoon light of the suite, she understood, standing at the door, that the word she'd used, formidable, had been an understatement. He looked at her. She had not prepared for what it would be like to be looked at by him. She had looked at him for 40 days. She had looked at the still, unresponsive version of him, and catalogued every angle and accounted for every detail, and told him, more or less, everything. But him looking back, The dark eyes, the precise focus, the absolute quality of his attention that she had seen once, briefly, on the morning he woke, and that had not diminished at all in the 3 days since. She had not accounted for that. "Chloe Marchetti," he said. His voice was different from how she'd expected, though she hadn't known she'd had an expectation. Deeper, and with an accent that was Italian in the vowels and something else, Cuban, she thought, something warm and rhythmic in the consonants. The sound of it rearranged something in her chest that she immediately tried to put back. "How do you know my last name?" she said. "Marco told me." She stepped into the room, found the professional distance. "How do you feel?" "Better." He watched her approach. "You're not on my care team?" "No." "But you came." She didn't answer that the way Dr. Ruiz had not answered hers. "You asked for me." "Sit down." It wasn't quite a request. She sat in the chair, a different chair now, not the plastic ICU chair, but something a great deal more comfortable, which had presumably arrived with the rest of the room's reinvention, and met his eyes across the bed and tried to arrange herself in the way she arranged herself at every bedside, present, composed, at a certain professional remove. The professional remove was not quite working. "You talked to me," he said. Something cold moved through her. "That's part of the protocol with comatose patients. There's evidence that auditory stimulation, you talked to me." He said it the same way, unhurried, with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than insistence would have been. "For 40 days." She said nothing. "I heard you," he said. The room was very quiet. Outside the suite, somewhere in the secured corridor, someone was talking. The gardenias on the window ledge were the same flowers, different blooms, same plant, and they sat in the afternoon light with their white faces and their impossible scent. And Chloe sat in the chair and understood, with a plummeting clarity, that the sealed room had opened. "How much," she said carefully, "do you remember?" "Everything." The word landed without ceremony, just a fact, just the truth. Everything. She sat with it, let it settle, felt the specific quality of it, the way it reorganized the last 40 days from one thing into another, retrospectively. The way a light turned on reveals that the room was never empty. "You heard everything," she said. "Everything." She looked at the gardenias. She looked at her hands. She looked back at him. "I see," she said. "I want to ask you something," Raphael said. "Okay." "The man, Daniel," he said, "the one who turned off the light to save electricity." Her jaw was very tight. "Yes." "Are you still in contact with him?" The question was so far from what she'd expected, what she'd braced for, that it almost broke her composure in a different direction. She blinked. "No. Why?" "I'm trying to understand the landscape," he said, and there was something in the phrase, the precision of it, the landscape, that made her think she was in a conversation that had started before she'd arrived. I haven't spoken to Daniel in 18 months. We're not." She stopped. "You don't need to know that." "No," he said. "I know." He looked at her, that unflinching, particular attention. "I know I don't need to know it. I'm asking because I want to know it." The silence stretched. "This is very strange," she said finally. Yes. You're in a hospital bed. Yes. You were in a coma for 40 days. Yes. And you're asking me about my ex-boyfriend. Yes. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, barely, but she caught it. I'm also interested in your cat. She stared at him, and then, because there was absolutely nothing else to do with this moment, she laughed. It came out of her like something that had been held too long, genuine and unguarded and a little helpless, and she saw him, across the bed, do something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory, something rare on that face, she could already tell, something that cost something. Dostoevsky is fine, she said. He's been ignoring me for 11 years. A Crime and Punishment reference, he said. Or The Idiot. The brothers Karamazov, actually. He has brother energy. She caught herself, sat back. I shouldn't. Don't, he said. Not sharply, just plainly. Don't go careful on me now. She looked at him. I was always careful with you. No, he said, you weren't. That's why I'm asking. He was discharged from Miami General on a Thursday, 15 days after waking, and Chloe was not there for the discharge because she was not, by then, on his care team and had not been for a week, and the most professional thing she could do was treat his departure the way she treated the departure of all her patients, as the natural conclusion of the episode. She had visited him twice more in the intervening days, both times because he had sent Marco with a message. He'd like to see you when you have a moment, which Marco said with the delivery of a man who understood that the message was technically a request and operationally a summons, but was committed to maintaining the fiction of optionality. Both times she had gone. Both times she had stayed for exactly 40 minutes. She had not set a timer, but she knew it was 40 minutes because she was aware of time in that room in a way she was not aware of it elsewhere. Their conversations were... she could not characterize them properly. He asked questions, and she answered them with the residual honesty of someone who had already been known and had no energy left for performance. He did not say much about himself. He asked about her city, her work, her training. He asked about nursing school and the moment she'd chosen trauma care and the old Italian man who had heard her reading Dante. He asked about the farmer's market and about Dostoevsky the cat and about the quiet bar where she drank one glass of wine and read. He was, in the asking, completely focused. There was nothing casual about the way he listened. There was the sense with him that information was never neutral, that everything you gave him became part of a structure he was building. It was not comfortable. It was also not, she couldn't call it uncomfortable. It was the feeling of being the subject of an intelligence that was not gentle, but was completely attentive, and she had not known before that those could be the same thing. He told her almost nothing. She noticed this and did not ask. She had cared for enough powerful men to understand that they did not give themselves away, that what they shared was always a choice, not an impulse, and the choice to share nothing, in this case, was not withholding so much as a statement. I'm not the one on the table here. But on the second visit, near the end, he said, You read me the Inferno. I did. From your own copy? Yes. You had notes in the margins. She looked at him. You could hear the difference between a marked-up copy and a clean one. I could hear you pause to read what you'd written. She was quiet. What did you write next to the first canto? He asked. I don't remember, she said, which was not true. He let it go. But his eyes said he knew it wasn't true, and the knowing was in the room between them, and she left it there and said goodbye and walked out and stood in the elevator for 6 floors with her hands in her pockets and her jaw set and her face doing nothing. The week after his discharge, she went to the Fig and had her glass of wine and read for an hour and felt almost like herself. The almost was the problem. It sat in the corner of the almost, like a fact she was refusing to look at directly, and it had dark eyes and a voice that had 2 countries in it and a thumb that had moved once across the inside of her wrist. She was going to be perfectly fine. She came home to Dostoevsky, who was in the kitchen and regarded her arrival with professional neutrality, and she fed him and watered her 1 plant and put on the kettle and sat on her couch and looked at the bookshelf and thought about the Inferno. She reached for the copy, opened it to the first canto, looked at what she'd written in the margin.
What does the dark wood feel like from the inside, if it's where you've always lived?
She put the book down, looked at the ceiling. Her phone lit up. Unknown number, Miami area code. She stared at it for 2 rings, picked up.
Chloe Marchetti,
Said the voice that had 2 countries in it.
how did you get this number?
She said, which was not really a question.
Marco.
I'm going to have a conversation with Marco about professional boundaries.
He says you're welcome.
She closed her eyes, opened them.
What do you want, Raphael?
The pause was brief. She heard something in the background, quiet, expensive, the particular quality of a penthouse, which was a sound she recognized from exactly nowhere, and yet somehow knew. To talk, he said. I find I've become accustomed to the sound of your voice. I spent 40 days talking to you. You spent 40 days listening. There's an imbalance there. Yes, he said. I want to correct it. She looked at Dostoevsky, who had come to sit on the coffee table and was regarding her with an expression of complete impartiality. I'm not, she started, stopped. Raphael, I'm a nurse. You're whatever you are. These are different worlds. I know what I am, he said, and there was nothing in his voice that was defensive about it. I've always known. And you knew, in that room, and you stayed, and you talked to me anyway. You said you don't care what I've done. You said, your job is the breath. She had said that. She had said exactly that, thinking she was speaking into a well. It was different then, she said. Yes, he said. Then I couldn't answer. Now I can. The silence between them was long and had a quality she didn't want to name. Come to dinner, he said. My place, Saturday. Not a date? The almost smile she couldn't see, but somehow heard. I can't call it that before I've given you a choice. Just dinner. I'll have it catered. You can bring the Dostoevsky if you want. I'm not bringing my cat. So you're coming. She heard what he'd done. That was a trick. That was a conversation. She breathed. Saturday, she said. 2 hours. And if I'm uncomfortable at any point, you leave, he said immediately. You always leave when you want to. I want to be clear about that. And it was that. The clarity of it, the absence of pressure in the saying of it, that undid her more completely than anything else he could have said. She thought about Daniel, who had turned off the light to save electricity. She thought about soulmate and how she had run. She thought about 40 days in a room where she had been entirely herself and had thought there were no consequences. Saturday, she said. She hung up and looked at the ceiling for a long time, and Dostoevsky, who had opinions about everything, said nothing. He lived in the sky above Brickell. This was her first thought when the elevator opened directly into the penthouse, that he lived in the sky, that the city was spread below the floor-to-ceiling glass like an offering, the bay silver in the Saturday evening light, the downtown skyline doing its neon imitation of importance, the ocean beyond it all, a dark suggestion at the horizon. Her second thought was about the gardenias. They were everywhere, in low white pots along the windows, in a stone planter by the kitchen, in a cut crystal vase on the dining table. The whole space smelled of them, a scent that had, over 40 days in a hospital room, become inseparable from something she was still refusing to fully identify. Raphael was in the kitchen. This was not what she had expected, though she had not known she'd had an expectation. She'd somehow pictured marble columns, probably, men with earpieces, the elaborate staging of power. Not a man in a dark linen shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, standing at a counter with a glass of red wine and what appeared to be a detailed opinion about the salads someone had catered. He looked up when the elevator opened. His eyes moved over her in a way that was thorough without being rude, just assessing, the way he assessed everything, as if visual information was data he required and would process thoroughly. She was wearing a dark green dress that she'd put on after trying 4 other outfits, which she would tell no one. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "People say many things." He set down the glass and crossed the room toward her, moving with an ease that still surprised her, 4 weeks out from the injury, as if his body had been in a hurry to be itself again. He stopped at the proper distance. Proper distance. She noticed he'd assessed it. "You look—" He paused, considered. "Like yourself." "That's an odd compliment." "It's the only one that means anything." She looked around the penthouse. The books were the thing that surprised her most. He had more books than could be accounted for by staging, shelves that ran the length of one wall, organised in some system that was not alphabetical and not by colour, which meant it was personal. History, fiction, what looked like philosophy, several in Italian, several in Spanish. "Dante," she said, pulling a volume from the shelf. "Original Italian." "My mother's copy," he said. She looked at the inside cover, handwriting in a neat, small hand, a woman's name, Maria Elena Reyes de Conti, and a date, 1987, which would have been, she calculated, before he was born. She put it back carefully. He had guided them to the table while she was looking at the books, subtly, the way a current moved you, without your noticing you were being moved. And they were seated, with wine and the food appearing in stages, the way a proper dinner appeared. And she thought, he has done this before. He has done this before. And it was probably different every time. And tonight, it's different again in a way he's aware of. "You're thinking something," he said. "I'm always thinking something." "What is it?" She looked at him across the table. "That you're very good at this." "At what?" "At—" she gestured vaguely. "At creating conditions." Something moved in his face. "You think this is a performance?" "I think everything is a performance until it isn't." He was quiet for a moment, turning the stem of his wineglass between his fingers in a gesture that was meditative. "What would it take to be until it isn't?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never gotten there." "With anyone?" She met his eyes, dark, absolute. the most direct gaze she had ever been the subject of. With anyone. He looked at her for a long moment. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I heard everything you said, he said. I know you know that, but I need you to understand, I know you. I know how you think about love and what it did to you when your father died and why the Pantheon matters and what you hear when you read the Inferno and why you're afraid of the word soulmate and why you stayed in that room every shift for 40 days even though you didn't have to. He paused. I know you. The room was very still. And I want you to know me, he said. I'm not asking you to accept what I am. I'm asking you to give me what you gave me in that room. He paused, and she heard him searching for the word, which was the most human thing she had seen him do, and the most disarming. The truth of it. She looked at her glass, at the table, at the gardenias in the crystal vase. That was supposed to be private, she said. I know. I thought you couldn't hear. I know. That changes what it was. Yes. She looked at him. And you're not sorry about it. He held her gaze. No. She exhaled, long, slow. You're an incredibly complicated man. Yes. You were easier when you were asleep. That almost smile again. She was cataloguing it now, the way she had catalogued the furrow in the underlying, the way it cost him something, the way it was real precisely because it didn't come easily. I'm going to disappoint you on that front, he said. She picked up her wine glass, held it, said, Ask me something. Something you couldn't ask before. He was quiet for a moment, then, What did you write in the margin of the Inferno? She looked at him for a long time. The evening had gone fully dark around them, the city lights were doing their thing below, and the gardenias were doing theirs, and the wine was excellent in the way that things were excellent when money was not the constraint. What does the dark wood feel like from the inside, she said, if it's where you've always lived? He was still, and then, very quietly, the same. It feels exactly the same. She left at midnight. He walked her to the elevator, not the whole distance, not with ceremony, but he moved with her to the edge of the penthouse floor and stood there while the doors opened, and she stepped in and turned, and they looked at each other across the small gap of the threshold. Thank you, she said. For what? Dinner. For being... She stopped. For not being what I expected. What did you expect? More armour, she said. Less books. The elevator doors began to close. Through the narrowing gap she saw him standing in the light of his penthouse, in his dark linen shirt with his wine-glass, looking at her with that attention, and she held his gaze until the doors closed completely. In the lobby, she stood for a moment in the cool, air-conditioned silence and looked at nothing and breathed. Her phone lit up. What did you expect me to be? She looked at the text. Then, because she had already decided tonight to be honest, someone it was easier not to like. His reply took 40 seconds. I'll take that. The trouble started the following Thursday. She knew it was trouble, the way you knew certain things in Miami, by the quality of the attention, the men in the wrong place, the car that appeared on her street twice in 2 days. She was not, she should be clear, an inexperienced woman. She had grown up in a city where certain kinds of trouble had certain kinds of signatures, and she recognized this signature. Someone was watching her. She told no one for 24 hours because she needed to be certain, and she needed to understand what she was certain about before she started making decisions that would change things. On the second day, the car was still there, a dark sedan with tinted windows, parked at the curb across from her building, and she stood at her kitchen window with her coffee and looked at it and thought about what this meant and what she was going to do about it. She called Marco. She had his number from the discharge paperwork. He was listed as emergency contact, and she had never called it, but she dialed it now with the steadiness she brought to difficult things, and he answered on the second ring. "There's a car on my street," she said. "Dark sedan. It's been there 2 days." A brief pause. "I'll have someone check the plate," Marco said, without any of the surprise she might have expected, which told her that this was a world in which this was a thing that happened and was handled as a matter of routine. "Don't go outside until I call you back." "I have work in 3 hours." "I'll call you back in 20 minutes. He called back in 15. "Not hours," he said. "I need you to pack a bag." "Marco." 20 minutes, Ms. Marchetti. I'm sending a car." She stood in her kitchen with her phone in her hand and looked at Dostoevsky, who was on the counter and regarding all of this with his usual absence of opinion. "This is a complication," she told the cat. Dostoevsky licked his paw. The car took her not to the penthouse, but to a different address. A house in Coconut Grove, which was perhaps 20 blocks from her apartment. A low, white building set back behind a garden that had, she noted, gardenias planted along the front wall. Marco met her at the door. Behind him, inside, she could see the organised activity of several men who were very clearly managing a situation. Laptops, phones, the contained, controlled energy of people doing things that they were competent to do and that she did not need to know the details of. "What's happening?" she asked. "Someone is interested in you," Marco said. "We believe it's related to the organisation that commissioned the attack on Raphael. We're still determining the extent of it." "Am I—" She stopped. "Am I bait?" "No," Marco said, with a directness that she believed. "You're a pressure point. There's a difference. Bait is a choice. A pressure point is information someone's acting on because they've assessed that Raphael—" He paused, chose his words. "That his interest in your well-being is significant." She looked at him. "How long has he been interested in my well-being?" "Since approximately day 4, Marco said, with the complete neutrality of a man who has decided that honesty is the policy and is committed to it. He asked me to establish care protocols. Have you monitored? Not intrusively." "Not intrusively," she repeated. "He wouldn't allow anything intrusive." She pressed her lips together. She was going to have a great deal to say about this, and none of it was going to be simple. "Where is he?" "Inside." "Is he going to walk in here and be surprised to see me?" "No, he knows you're here." "Of course he does." She picked up her bag. "Marco, this can't be my life." Marco looked at her with an expression that was almost gentle, which she hadn't known he was capable of. "No," he said, "it can't. But it might be for a few days, and Raphael would like to talk to you." She walked inside. He was in a room at the back of the house, standing at a window that looked over a garden that had gone dark, the gardenias in moonlight, like pale faces, tilted up at something. He turned when she entered, and she saw it, the thing she had not seen at the hospital, which was the version of him that was operational, that was running at full capacity, that was the thing he was when the world was coming after him and he was coming back at it. She had thought that first morning in room 14C that he was formidable. She had not known the half of it. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. You've been having me watched." "Protected," he said. "Watched implies—" "Don't." She set her bag down. "Don't use language to make it smaller than it is. You've had men watching me since week 1. I told you things in that room, thinking it was private, and you were already arranging things." He was quiet. He didn't move. He let her have the full force of her own words, which was either respect or strategy, and she wasn't certain yet which. "I told you about my father," she said, "about Daniel, about the Pantheon. I read you Dante, and you were already—" "I heard you first," he said. "The rest came from that. He stopped. The protection came from the fact that someone shot me because I'm who I am, and you were in that room every day, and I heard your voice, and I knew—" Something moved in his jaw. "I knew I wasn't going to let anything happen to you." The silence was very long. "You had no right to decide that," she said, "without telling me." "No," he said, "I didn't." "Are you sorry?" He looked at her. Dark eyes, absolute attention, and the answer was visible before he said it. "No," he said, "I'm not sorry you're safe." She looked at the ceiling, at the gardenias through the window, at the man who had heard her say her truest things in the dark, and had begun from that moment to structure the world around them. "This is impossible," she said. "Yes," he said, "you understand that. Yes. And yet you're here, doing this." "Yes," he said, and then, quietly, "Chloe, there is a conversation I want to have with you when this situation is resolved, and you are safe, and you have had time to think. I want to have it properly. I want to give you what you gave me, which is the truth of it, without an audience and without pressure." He looked at her. "Can you give me a few days?" She looked at him for a long time. "A few days," she said. "And then we have the conversation." "Yes." She picked up her bag. "Is there a room?" "Down the hall. Marco put your cat in there." She stopped. "You have Dostoevsky?" "Marco collected him with your bag. He didn't want to leave the cat in an unsecured building." She stared. "Marco?" She was somewhere between exasperated and, against all better judgment, moved. "Marco picked up my cat. He said Dostoevsky was cooperative. He lies to strangers. He came willingly. He's a traitor," she said, with the tone of a woman who is finding things funny against her will, and she walked down the hall toward the room, and Raphael Conti stood in his garden room and looked at the door she'd gone through, and felt, for the first time in 41 years of living, something that was not power, and not control, and not the satisfaction of a problem resolved, but was, larger than all of those, was something he had no previous name for. He was going to need a word for it. 3 days. They were the strangest 3 days of her adult life. She could not quite categorize them as captivity, because she could leave. He told her this clearly on the first morning over the kind of breakfast that the house's apparently permanent kitchen staff produced without ceremony. The kind of breakfast that involved fresh fruit and espresso and bread that had clearly been baked that morning. The kind of breakfast that made her feel that her own kitchen habits were a personal failing. He told her she could leave, and that if she did, he would arrange protection she would not see, but that would be there. "I know how to be discreet," he said. "You've demonstrated that," she said. He accepted the point, with a look that was not quite apology, and not quite not. She stayed. Not because she felt she had to, but because, and this was the part she hadn't fully worked through, she was not in this house, with this man and this garden and these gardenias, uncomfortable. She was the opposite of uncomfortable. She was, she noticed with alarm, entirely at ease. She went to work. The car took her to the hospital and collected her, and she performed the gracious fiction of not looking at the driver in the rear-view mirror and thinking about what this meant for her life as a person who made her own arrangements. And she cared for her patients with the same discipline she always brought, and came home to a house that was not hers, and a garden that was, and a man who was present at dinner and absent the rest of the time. Managing whatever he was managing with the contained efficiency of someone who did not bring work to the table. At dinner, he talked. This was the surprise. She had thought she would do most of the talking, the imbalance he'd mentioned, the 40 days he'd listened, she talking and him finally going careful. Instead, he talked. He told her about Rome, not the city she knew from her 2 weeks of tourism, but the city he knew, which was older and more violent and beautiful in the way that things that had survived very long were beautiful. He told her about his father's family in Havana, the house he'd never seen because his father had left and not gone back, and the photograph his grandmother had kept on her wall of a street that had been renamed and a house that no longer existed. "Cuba is like that," he said, "a place that keeps changing its mind about itself. I understand that. I've done the same." "What kind of man were you?" she asked, "before?" He looked at her across the dinner table. "Cold," he said. "Efficient. He paused. "I had organized my life to require very little of me emotionally. It was sustainable. I recommended it." "And now?" He was quiet. "Something has been disrupted," he said finally. 40 days of being still in a room with a woman who said true things, followed by the realization that I had been, all my adult life, in a room alone with the lights off. He looked at his wine glass. "It is an uncomfortable thing to discover." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me that what happened in that room—" "I'm going to tell you exactly that," he said, "not to pressure you, because you asked, and I don't lie about things that matter." She sat with that. "I said too much in there," she said. "You said the right things," he said. "I don't know if there's a distinction." On the second morning, Dostoevsky, who had been residing in her room with the total autonomy of a house guest who had decided to stay, appeared in the kitchen at 7 a.m. and walked directly to Raphael, who was standing at the counter with an espresso, and sat at his feet and looked up at him with the expression of a creature conducting an evaluation. Raphael looked down at the cat. The cat looked up at Raphael. Chloe came in from the garden. She'd been out with her coffee watching the gardenias in the early light, which was something she was beginning to understand as a morning habit she was acquiring, and stopped in the kitchen doorway at this tableau. Raphael crouched down and held his hand out, which Dostoevsky sniffed with the gravity of a notary. Then the cat pressed his face against Raphael's knuckles. Chloe stood in the doorway, and something in her chest did the thing she'd been trying to manage for weeks. "He never does that," she said. Animals are accurate, Raphael said, straightening. He's supposed to be on my side. He is on your side, Raphael said, meeting her eyes. He's just telling you something. She looked at the cat, who was now winding around Raphael's ankles with the complete treachery of a creature who had made a decision and committed to it. I'm aware, she said. She went to pour her coffee and absolutely did not smile. On the second evening, something shifted. They were in the garden after dinner. She had started to like the garden, with its inefficient extravagance of gardenias and its private darkness beyond the wall of the grove's old trees, and he was telling her about a property he had in Trastevere, an apartment above a courtyard that had a lemon tree that had been there since the 1800s, and she was listening, with her feet folded under her in the outdoor chair, and the conversation had the quality of something that didn't know it was going to be important. "Do you go there often?" she asked. "Less than I used to. There's more here lately." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her, which she understood was deliberate. He was giving her the thing without requiring her to receive it in full. "Raphael," she said. He looked at her. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without doing anything with it. Just hear it." "All right." "I've spent my entire adult life trying to," she breathed, "trying to be very careful with people, with how much I give and how much I let in. And it's worked. I have a very orderly life that I can manage and that doesn't ask too much of me." She looked at her hands. "And then you were in a bed unconscious and I let everything out. I said everything. I was entirely myself for 40 days because I thought there were no consequences." "And now there are consequences," he said. "And now there are consequences," she agreed. He was quiet. And then, "What are you afraid of?" She looked at him, the dark eyes, the patience of him. "That I know the still version of you," she said, "the underneath, the version that can't push back or move or choose. And the awake version is," she gestured, more complicated and more present and more—" She stopped. "I'm afraid that I fell in, that what I feel is about what it was, not what it is." He was quiet for a long time. In the garden, the gardenias moved in the slight nighttime breeze off the bay. "I'm not him," he said, "the still version. But I was. That was also me." He looked at her. "And everything I am now, it comes from what I was then, in that room, hearing you. There is no version of this that doesn't start there." She looked at him. "I don't know how to do this," she said, quietly, simply. "I know," he said. "Neither do I." And then, with the same simplicity, which was the most honest thing he had said, and therefore the most dangerous, "Let's do it wrong until we get it right." On the third day, they found who'd ordered the hit. She was in the hospital, on shift, when Marco sent a message that was 3 words: "Stay inside today." And she looked at it from the nurse's station, and read it the way you read something that is not telling you the full thing, and is telling you that for a reason. She stayed inside. She finished her shift. She thought about the man in the Coconut Grove house, dealing with whatever was being dealt with, and she thought about what it meant to have a life that required "stay inside today" messages, and whether she was the kind of person who could do that. And she was honest with herself in the nurse's break room at 5 p.m. with a bad cup of coffee, that the answer was not clear. The car arrived at the end of her shift, different driver. She sat in the back and watched the city through the tinted windows, her city, the city she'd grown up adjacent to and trained in and made her orderly life in, and thought about her apartment in Coconut Grove and whether she'd go back to it. The Coconut Grove house was quiet when she arrived. The kitchen staff was there, the food was there, the gardenias were there. Raphael was not. Marco was. "He'll be back by 9, Marco said. "Is he all right?" "Yes." He said it in a way that meant he is all right, and someone else is considerably less so, and you don't need the details. She accepted this in the way she was learning to accept the silences around the things she didn't need to know. "Who ordered it?" she asked. Marco looked at her. "That's not information Marco." He was quiet for a moment, then, "A family in Rome, the Castellis. They've had a disagreement with Raphael's organization for some years. They used the Miami operation as an opportunity." "And the men on my street?" "They were trying to determine whether Raphael had a weakness, an external pressure point." Marco's jaw was set. They found their answer. She sat down at the kitchen table. "He's more dangerous to me like this," she said, not to Marco, to herself, "than if he didn't, than if I was just another person." "Yes," Marco said, "that is correct. It is also true that there is not a safer place on earth for you than where you are right now." She looked at him. "That's both reassuring and terrifying." "Yes," he said again, "that is also correct." He came back at 8:30. She heard the elevator, heard him move through the house with the controlled efficiency of a man who was still operational, not wound down yet, still running, and she was in the kitchen with a glass of wine and the remains of the dinner that had been left out, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He stopped. They looked at each other. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes." He came into the kitchen, poured himself water, not wine, drank it standing. She watched him and said nothing, and let him have the silence, because some moments were for silence. After a while, he set the glass down. "It's resolved," he said. "Marco told me about the Castellis." He looked at her. "He told you that they wanted to know if you had a weakness." She held his gaze. "Do you want to talk about what that means? About what—" She chose her words. "About what that means for what this is between us." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen, deliberate, unhurried, and stood at the counter near her chair, close enough that the conversation stopped being hypothetical. "It means," he said, "that anyone in this world who wants to move against me will now know that there is something to move against. That is a real risk. It is a risk that you deserve to understand completely." "I understand it." "Do you?" She looked up at him. "Raphael, I'm a trauma nurse in Miami. I've seen what men in your world can do to people. I've sewn it up, and I've watched it not be enough, and I've—" She stopped. "I'm not naive about this." "Being not naive about it is different from living inside it." "I know that too." She set down her wine glass. "I know the difference. I'm asking you to let me make the choice with the full information, not make it for me, to protect me from the information." Something moved in his face. "You're very—" He stopped. "What?" "There's a word in Italian," he said, "coraggiosa. But that's not quite. It's not bravery, exactly. It's—" He looked at her. It's the quality of knowing what is difficult and going toward it anyway, because you've decided the difficult thing is worth it. She looked at him for a long time. "I've decided," she said, "that the difficult thing might be worth it." That's different from having decided it is. I know. You can live with that? I can work with it, he said. And the distinction, live with versus work with, was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd said in a long time. She picked up her wineglass. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me about the Castellis." He looked at her. The full weight of that attention, the dark eyes that missed nothing, and then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And he told her the truth, and she listened. 2 weeks later, he asked her to come to Rome. They were at the penthouse. She had been to the penthouse twice since the Coconut Grove episode, both times for dinner, both times on her own terms, which she'd been clear about and which he'd respected with a meticulousness that was either genuine or extremely convincing. And she was still not entirely certain which, and the uncertainty was its own form of paying attention. "I have business there," he said. "A week, possibly 10 days. I want you to come." She looked at him. "You want to take me to Rome?" "Yes." "For business?" "For Rome," he said. "I have business there. The business and the invitation are separate things." She looked at the city through his penthouse windows. "I have shifts." "Diane says you haven't taken vacation in 18 months. She turned. "You talked to Diane?" "I asked Marco to look into it." "Raphael." "I know," he said. "I know. He looked almost for a moment as if he were going to apologize. He settled for something more honest. "I have an organizing instinct. When I want something to work, I build conditions for it. I understand that is something we are still negotiating." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes, patient, unwilling to look away first, which was so consistently him that she'd stopped finding it challenging and started finding it something else. 2 weeks' notice for the leave, she said, and I arrange my own travel. All right. My itinerary is my own. All right. And I'll need you to understand that I will go wherever I want while I'm there. I'm not going to be managed. I understand. Do you? He looked at her. Chloe, I want to show you the city I know. The Pantheon at 6 in the morning, the apartment in Trastevere with the lemon tree, the Cacio e Pepe in a place that's been there since before my father was born. I'm not asking to arrange you, she breathed. When? 3 weeks after your leave processes. 3 weeks, she said, looked at the gardenias on the window ledge. Okay. Okay, he said. And there was something in it, quiet and certain, that she was going to think about later. She told her mother on Sunday, the regular call, Fort Lauderdale, her mother who asked when Chloe was going to find someone. I'm going to Rome, Chloe said, with someone. A silence on the line that was more expressive than words. Who? His name is Raphael. Italian? Italian and Cuban. Dio mio. A pause. What does he do? Chloe considered this. He's in finance, she said, and real estate. It's complicated. Finance, her mother repeated, in the tone of a woman who has been born in this city and knows exactly what finance can mean when it is also complicated. Your father would have opinions. Papa always had opinions. Your papa would have liked him, her mother said, changing direction so suddenly that Chloe blinked. I can hear it, in how you're not saying things. A pause. He's serious. I don't know yet. You know, her mother said. You've always known things you refuse to admit. Chloe sat with that for a while after the call ended. She did know. That was the problem. She knew the way you knew certain things in the underneath, in the space before choice, before the mind with its reasons and its cautions and its vocabulary for self-protection could organize itself into the usual defenses. She had known in room 14C. She had known on the morning he woke and looked at her with those dark eyes. She had known in the penthouse and in the Coconut Grove house and in every dinner and every drive home and every text that arrived at unexpected hours. She had known. She was still deciding what to do with knowing. Rome was Rome, which is to say, Rome was overwhelming and ancient and had the particular quality of a city that had been everything: capital of the world, seat of empire, cradle of the church, bone of the Renaissance, and had survived all of it and was now in the business of simply being itself, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was, on any given morning, at any given intersection, staggering. They arrived on a Tuesday. The apartment in Trastevere was on the third floor of a building that had been old when Garibaldi was young, with walls the colour of dried roses and shutters that opened over a courtyard where the lemon tree, the 1800s lemon tree, which was enormous and organised and operating on its own timeline, stood in the centre of a cobbled space, like an elder presiding over proceedings. The apartment had high ceilings and old tile floors, and books that were a continuation of the penthouse shelves and gardenias in pots on every windowsill. She stood in the doorway of the apartment and looked at all of it and thought, he lives like this. This is actually how he lives. The bedroom is yours, he said, coming in behind her with her bag. I'll take the study. She turned. This is your apartment. You're my guest. She looked at him. He was looking at the apartment with something that was, she caught it barely, something that was anticipation. The controlled, patient, long-deferred anticipation of a man who has wanted to show someone something for a long time and is finally in the moment of showing them. Thank you, she said, simply. Something shifted in his face. Come on, he said. Let me show you the city. He showed her the city he knew, which was different from the city the guidebooks knew. He knew the church in Pineto that was always unlocked and always empty, and had a Caravaggio no one talked about, the Calling of St. Matthew, hidden behind a later, lesser work in the side chapel, and she stood in front of it for 10 minutes without speaking. He knew the bar in the Jewish quarter where they made the best suppli she had ever eaten. She said this, and he said wait, and she didn't understand until 3 days later, when he took her to a different bar, and she understood. He knew the section of the Palatine Hill that tourists missed, where you could sit among the brick ruins of the Flavian Palace and look over the Forum and the Colosseum and the whole layered archaeology of time, and she sat there in the afternoon heat and thought, he wanted to show me this specific view. He'd thought about it. You've been planning this, she said. He was sitting beside her, his arm resting on his knee, looking at the Forum below them. Yes. Since when? He was quiet for a moment. Since day 23, he said. When you told me about the Pantheon. She looked at him. 23 days in. He had been in the underneath, in the dark, in the corridor between sleep and consciousness, and he had heard her talk about a building and begun from that moment to construct a trip to show it to her properly. "Raphael," she said. He looked at her. "I don't know what to do with you," she said, not helplessly. There was something more like wonder in it than distress. "I know," he said. "I'm aware. I'm working on being patient about it." "How's that going?" Something moved in his face, that barely there movement at the corner of his mouth. "I'm managing." She woke before dawn on the fourth day. She'd been restless, the time difference, the Roman street sounds that were different from Miami's, the particular quality of sleeping in a city that was doing something different outside your window. She lay in the old bed with its linen sheets and listened to the apartment. She could hear him in the study, the occasional movement, the low sound of a call, the quality of a man who was always working, who was probably always working, who had probably never in his adult life woken before dawn and not been working. She got up, dressed, went to the kitchen and made coffee from the mocha pot on the stove. She'd figured out the mocha pot on day 2, and she stood at the window with her coffee and looked at the courtyard and the lemon tree in the pre-dawn grey. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You're up," he said. "I'm up." She held up the coffee. "I figured out the mocha." "I heard." He came into the kitchen. The shirt was the same one from last night. He'd been working all night, she understood. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Now?" "Yes." They walked through Trastevere in the dark, the cobblestones slick from the previous evening's brief rain, the streets entirely empty, the cat that lived on their block regarding their passage from the warmth of a doorway with Roman equanimity. They walked across the Tiber, the river dark and low and smelling of wet stone, and through the Centro Storico, with its Baroque churches still shut and its fountains running for no one, and he walked slightly ahead of her, not leading, more like clearing a space, and she kept up without thinking about it. They arrived at the Pantheon at 10 minutes to 6. The piazza was empty, truly empty. No tourists, no vendors, no Romans in their morning rush, because the Romans who had somewhere to be were taking other streets. Just the fountain square and the ancient portico with its 8 granite columns and the tremendous doors, and above it all the triangular pediment with its weathered inscription to Agrippa. And beyond the doors she could feel it, even from outside, the interior with its perfect dome and its open eye. It was raining slightly. A fine, indecisive rain that was barely a rain, more a suggestion of one. He said nothing. He had stopped walking and was watching her face. She looked at the Pantheon, at the rain falling through the grey sky, at the building that had been standing for 2,000 years and had seen everything, empire and plague and pilgrimage and tourism and the whole long catastrophe and comedy of human civilization, and was still standing, still there, still accepting the weather. "The oculus," she said. "Yes." "It'll be raining inside." "Yes." She looked at him. "That's why you brought me now." "That's why we came now," he said. "You said, in the room, you said you'd been there when it was raining, that the rain coming through the open dome made you understand something about being temporary." She had said that. Day 21. She'd been talking about a memory she'd had as a closed jar, something she'd given to no one, and she'd given it to a man in a coma, and he had carried it here. She looked at the Pantheon. She looked at the rain. She looked at Raphael Conti standing in the pre-dawn piazza in Rome with his coat and his dark eyes and the 40 days of everything she'd said inside him. And she felt something give way. Not break, not collapse, but give way, the way a thing that has been held too long, at last, with relief, puts down its weight. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Yes," he said. Just yes, as if he'd been waiting. "I'm in love with you," she said. "I have been since, I don't know when, since somewhere in those 40 days, maybe from the morning you woke up, maybe before." She breathed. "And I've been trying to talk myself out of it because the circumstances are insane, and you are who you are, and I'm Chloe," he said. "And I'm a trauma nurse from Coconut Grove who has a cat that ignores her, and Chloe." She stopped. He crossed the distance between them, 3 steps, unhurried, with the absolute certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is going. And he put his hands on her face, both hands, gentle and certain, and he looked at her for one moment that had no edges to it, that was just the moment, just the two of them in the Pantheon's piazza in the indecisive Roman rain. And then he kissed her. It was not the first kind of kiss. It was not the testing kind, not the question kind. It was the answer kind, the kind that said, "I knew, I knew, I knew," and had been patient about knowing. And she kissed him back with everything she'd been holding for 40 days and 3 weeks and every hour in between. And the rain came down on them both, and neither of them moved for a long time. When they stopped, he had his forehead against hers. "Since day 4, he said, very quietly. "I heard your voice and—" He stopped. "I don't have a word for it. I've been looking for the word." She thought about what he'd told her. Coraggiosa. The quality of going toward the difficult thing because you've decided it's worth it. "Innamorato," she said. "Since day 4. He pulled back enough to see her face. Something moved in his expression, something that was not quite the almost smile, that was more than the almost smile, that was the thing behind the almost smile that she understood now had always been there and had been waiting for this specific moment to emerge. "Yes," he said. "Innamorato." Exactly that. The Pantheon stood behind them in the rain, 2,000 years patient, accepting all weathers. Rome did something to time. They had a week, 10 days, and the days had a quality she could not account for, full and slow simultaneously, each one longer on the inside than the hours suggested, each one accumulating in her in the way that the best things accumulated, not as events, but as changes, permanent and quiet. He was different here in Rome than he was in Miami. Not more himself. She thought he was entirely himself everywhere, in a way very few people were, but differently himself. The operational quality relaxed slightly at the edges. There was something in this city that he allowed himself that he didn't allow elsewhere. She could see it in the way he moved through the streets, still watchful, still with the quality of a man who was always reading the room, but less armoured, she thought. Or rather, the armour was on, but not engaged. She asked him about it one evening. They were at a small table at the back of a trattoria in Testaccio. Not the tourist Testaccio, but the real one, with its market and its offal,
and its generation-old restaurants where they knew him by name, and the wine came without being ordered. "Rome forgives you," he said. "That's what I mean when I think about it. It's seen too much to be shocked by anything." He looked at the wine in his glass. "Miami is always asking you to become something. Rome assumes you're already done becoming." She thought about this. "And are you?" He looked at her across the small table, in the candlelight of a restaurant that was at least a century old, with the sounds of Roman Saturday night around them, and the gardenias in her hair. She had put one there that morning,
cutting it from the windowsill pot, and he had watched her do it and said nothing, but his expression had been something she was learning to read. "No," he said, "I don't think so. Not any more." They argued once, on the 6th day. It was about Rome and about a meeting he had that he was vague about, and about vagueness in general, which was a topic she had strong feelings about. "You can't tell me nothing forever," she said. They were in the apartment, both standing, which was different from the dinners and the sightseeing, different in quality, more real, more edged. "I'm not telling you nothing," he said. "I'm telling you what's relevant to you." "That's still a form of managing." "That's also a form of protecting." "Raphael." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for operational details. I'm asking you to not be a closed door when something is difficult. I spent 7 years talking to closed doors. I'm not doing that." He looked at her. Something moved in his jaw. "I'm not accustomed to being called on it," he said, after a moment. "I know." She held her ground. "I'm calling you on it." The silence was long. Outside, the lemon tree did its slow thing in the courtyard. "The meeting," he said finally, "is with the Castellis." She blinked. The family that ordered the hit on me. The situation in Miami was resolved, but the underlying relationship needs to be renegotiated. In Rome, at a table. This is how these things are done. She looked at him. "Is it dangerous?" "No. These meetings there are protocols, rules that exist because they benefit everyone." "Are you sure?" "Yes." He looked at her. "I would not have brought you to Rome for a dangerous meeting." She breathed, nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." "Thank you," he said, "for asking." She looked at him, this complicated, careful, powerful man who was learning, in this room, in this city, to open doors rather than close them, and she thought, this is the work. This is what it is. Not the Pantheon or the dinners. This. "I'm going to keep calling you on it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to keep resisting and then telling you anyway." She nodded. "That seems honest." "It's what I've got." She crossed the room, and he opened his arms and she went into them, because she was learning too that going toward was better than staying careful, that the light being on was worth more than the safety of the dark. On the last evening in Rome, they sat on the apartment's small terrace above the courtyard, and the lemon tree was lit from below by the garden light, and the city was doing its Roman night thing around them, sounds and smells, a church bell somewhere marking 10 o'clock, the distant percussion of a party. And she thought about the 40 days. She thought about room 14C and the gardenias and the machines, and the voice she'd given freely to the dark, and what had grown from it, this strange, specific, impossible thing. "What would have happened," she asked, "if you hadn't been shot?" He thought about this. I would have gone to Rome for a meeting, come back to Miami, done the next thing. He paused. I would not have. He stopped. There would not have been a reason to be still. I don't stay still. You had to be shot to stop long enough to hear something true. Yes, he said. I'm aware of the irony. She was quiet for a while. I'm not glad you were shot. I know. But I'm glad the 40 days happened. He looked at her. So am I. Every single one. Yes, he said. Every single one. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the Roman night, with the lemon tree below them, and the gardenias on the terrace railing, and the city that had been everything, doing its patient, ancient thing. They came back on a Tuesday, the same day of the week they'd left, as if Rome had returned them neatly to the point of departure. But she was not the same person who had left. She was, she thought, driving herself home to Coconut Grove from the airport, while Raphael went directly to a meeting, because he was always going directly to a meeting, which was something she was learning to accommodate as a feature of his existence. She was the same person, but differently organised. The same self, rearranged. She went to work the following morning. Her locker, her stethoscope, her name badge, the familiar orchestration of the shift. Diane looked at her across the nurse's station with the expression of a woman who has been watching a person for a long time and recognises a change. You look different, Diane said. I went to Rome. That's not what it is. Chloe looked at her. Diane? Don't Diane me. I've known you 7 years. You look like someone who has decided something. She thought about the Pantheon in the rain, the small table in Testaccio, the argument about the closed doors, the terrace above the lemon tree. I've decided something, she said. Is it good? She thought about it. Yes, she said. It's complicated and probably difficult and potentially. She thought about the Castellis, about stay-inside messages, about men in dark sedans on quiet streets. Periodically alarming, but yes, it's good. Diane was quiet for a moment. Is he good to you? She didn't have to think about that. Yes. Okay then, Diane said, and went back to her charts. Raphael called her that evening from what she understood was a meeting that had extended, as meetings in his world tended to extend. I'm late, he said. I know. I wanted to call. She was on her couch with Dostoevsky and the Inferno and the glass of wine that was better than usual, because she had learned, in Rome, that better wine was not an extravagance, but an investment in the quality of an evening. I'm fine. Take your time. I want to see you tonight. It's almost 10. I know. She looked at Dostoevsky, who was looking at her phone as if he could hear the voice from it. Come when you're done, she said. He arrived at 11:15, and she opened the door, and he was still in his suit from whatever the day had been. The suit that said power and money in the way that clothes could say those things when they were made by people who understood the vocabulary. And he looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Hi, she said. Hi, he said, and walked in like he belonged there, which he was starting to, which was a thought she was learning to let arrive without immediately showing at the door. Dostoevsky came to the kitchen to investigate and sat on the counter and regarded Raphael with the approval he'd demonstrated in Coconut Grove. Traitor, Chloe said to the cat. He has excellent taste, Raphael said. She poured him wine. He loosened his tie. And they sat in her kitchen, her small coconut grove kitchen with its one plant and its mocha pot, and talked until midnight, and the conversation had the quality of all the conversations, the quality of two people who are learning each other, not from scratch, but from a specific, particular starting point that most people never reached, and finding that from that starting point, everything felt closer. "You should stay," she said. She had not planned to say it. She said it the way she'd been learning to say things, without organizing it first. He looked at her. "Yes?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "If you want." He looked at her for a long moment, with that absolute, thorough, dark-eyed attention, and then said simply, "Yes." In the morning she woke early, and he was already up. She could hear the low sounds of him in the kitchen, the mocha pot she hadn't realized she'd shown him how to use, the particular sounds of a man who was always up early because sleep was something he did efficiently rather than enthusiastically. She lay in the bed and listened to the sounds of someone in her kitchen and thought, "This is new. This is entirely new." She got up and went to the kitchen, and he was standing at the counter with coffee and his phone, reading something in the grey early light, still in yesterday's suit trousers and a white shirt that was untucked now, and Dostoevsky was on the counter beside him, demanding attention with the total confidence of a cat who has made a political alliance. He looked up when she came in. "You figured out the mocha," she said. "You showed me. In Rome. In Rome." He held out the coffee. She took it. They stood in her small kitchen in the Miami morning, with the light coming up over Coconut Grove outside the window, and she thought, "Here we are. Here we are." He was not, she would be the first to say, an easy man to love. He was, the word she landed on was total. He was total in everything, total in his attention, total in his organization, total in the way he moved through the world as if the world were an environment he was always, on some level, managing. He had opinions about wine and about architecture and about certain politicians and about the way gardenias should be pruned. And these opinions were not negotiable, but they were also not imposed. He held them with the absolute certainty of a man who had arrived at his views through something more rigorous than taste, and was simply reporting the conclusion of the process. He was also, she discovered over the following weeks, jealous. Not in the dramatic way, not accusatory, not demanding, in the quiet, thorough way that was, in some ways, more difficult. She became aware of it gradually, the quality of his attention when she mentioned colleagues, the slight sharpening of his eyes when she described an interaction with anyone male, the texture of the silence when she said at dinner that a doctor on her floor had asked her to have coffee and she'd declined. "Why did you decline?" he asked. She looked at him. "Because I'm with you." "I know." He held her gaze. "I want to know your reason." "That is my reason." "I know," he said. "I know it is." A pause. "I'm working on the jealousy." She appreciated the honesty of the admission. She also said, "You need to work faster." He almost smiled. "Yes." "I have a life," she said. "I have colleagues and patients and a world. I'm not—" She looked at him. "I'm not going to shrink it to make the jealousy more manageable. That's not who I am." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to." "Do you know that, actually?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The jealousy isn't about distrust. You should know that. It's—" he looked for the word. "Awareness of the possibility of loss. I haven't—" he stopped. I haven't had something to lose in a very long time.
It makes me
Territorial, she said. Yes. You can be territorial without being controlling. That is a distinction I'm learning. She breathed. Good. And then, because she was not entirely unsympathetic, for what it's worth, the thing you're afraid of losing? I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her with those dark eyes and the full weight of him. I know, he said. I'm going to learn to know it. There were days that were difficult for different reasons. There was the day, 3 weeks after Rome, when a situation in his organization required him to be in a different city for 4 days, and he called every evening, and she answered every call, and on the third night she was tired from a double shift, and she was short with him, and they had a conversation that ended with her hanging up, which she had never done to anyone, and then sitting on her couch for 20 minutes, looking at the phone. He called back in 40 minutes. I was short too, he said. I hung up on you. You were tired. I was managing something I couldn't tell you about, and I was managing it badly. She breathed. Can you tell me about it now? Yes, let me tell you about it now. And he did. And it was not simple, not easy, not the kind of thing she could unhear or unfeel. But it was the truth, and the truth was what they'd agreed on in the argument in Rome about closed doors, and she held it and didn't flinch. Thank you, she said. Thank you for asking, he said. They were always going to be catching up to each other, she thought, always adjusting, always recalibrating. That was what this was, not the Pantheon, not the first kiss in the rain. This. The phone call at 11 at night after a hard day, when you were too tired for grace and had to be honest instead. This was the work. There was also the day that Marco came to the hospital and found her in the break room between patients, which she understood immediately from the quality of his arrival, controlled, purposeful, the stillness of a man who has important information and is delivering it with the care it deserves. Tell me, she said. The Castellis have made another move, he said. Different vector. There's an allegation, fabricated but documented, about Raphael's operations in Rome. It's going to press unless we... He stopped. Unless what? Unless we respond in a way that makes certain things public, Marco said, about him, about his associations. She looked at Marco. About me. The allegation implies leverage. If it's demonstrated that there's no leverage, that nothing in his private life can be used against him because it's already public. Yes. She sat with this. He knows? He's the one who sent me. He wanted to give you the choice. Marco looked at her with his direct, weathered gaze. He said to tell you that nothing about this is required, that you owe him nothing, that if you want no part of it, he will find another way. She thought about the 40 days, about what she'd said to him in the dark, about information being intimacy. When someone tells you the true thing, the thing underneath the performance, that's when you're close to them. Tell him, she said, that I've been public since the day I walked into room 14C and sat down in the chair and started talking. Marco looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that was the closest she'd seen him come to being moved. I'll tell him, he said. She did not fully know what happened next. She was not meant to, and she had made her peace with the parameters of that. There were things in his world that were not hers to know, and the discipline of accepting that without resenting it was ongoing and imperfect, but real. What she knew was this. 4 days after Marco's visit to the hospital, the allegation did not go to press. The Castellis, who had been the Castellis for a very long time, a Roman family of the old kind, with the deep roots and the long memory and the particular patience of people who operated in centuries rather than years, had apparently made a calculation. Raphael had presented them with a different calculation. The mathematics had changed. He told her this at dinner, simply, without elaboration, and she nodded and asked no more than he was telling her. But something had shifted. She could feel it in him, a settling, a resolution, the specific quality of a man who has put something to rest. Not peacefully, not without cost, but finally. "It's over?" she said. "This iteration," he said. "There will be others. There always are." He looked at her. "I want you to understand that." "I understand it. I want you to understand it for what it means for your life." She looked at him. "My life now includes stay inside today messages and cars I'm not supposed to notice and periodic Roman allegation crises. I've understood it for several months, Raphael. I'm choosing it." With open eyes. With open eyes. He looked at her for a long time, that thorough, particular attention that she had by now stopped trying to receive without feeling. She just felt it. That was the discipline too, to let things land, to not immediately redirect them. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "Okay? And I want you to understand that there's no pressure. Ask me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come to Rome. Not for a week. More—" He stopped. "Not forever if you don't want, but more than a week. Your work is something you can— Miami General isn't the only place that needs a trauma nurse of your caliber. Rome has hospitals. Rome has—" "You want me to move to Rome?" she said. "I want to ask you to consider it. I want—" He pressed his lips together. "I want the lemon tree to be something you see every morning. I want you to have the city I know. I want—" And here the controlled precision of him arrived at its edge, and she heard it. Heard what was underneath the organization and the managing and the careful structures. "I want to not have you on the other side of an ocean." She looked at him, at the dark eyes and the scarred knuckles, and the man who had heard her voice in the dark and built a whole new version of his life around the sound of it. "That's terrifying," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know. I'm asking anyway." She breathed, looked at the gardenias in the vase on the table between them, at the city outside his windows. "I need time," she said. "You can have all the time you want. You're going to be terrible at waiting." "Yes," he said. "I am." That almost smile. "I'll manage." She looked at him. 3 months, she said. "Give me 3 months to arrange things. If I'm doing it, if I decide to do it, I do it properly. I don't leave a job without notice, and I don't leave a life without closing it correctly." He held her gaze. 3 months. Don't make it into a countdown. I'll try. Try harder. He almost smiled fully. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the table and thought, 3 months is a very short time to make a very large decision. She also thought, I have already made it. She also thought, this is the feeling of the light being on. The 3 months were, as promised, 3 months.
She did not rush them. She did not, she was proud of this, allow herself to be rushed, even as his patience visibly cost him, even when he arrived in Miami with the contained energy of a man who was counting and trying not to count and failing at not counting. She gave each day its proper weight. She went to work. She cared for her patients. She sat with her notebook in the quiet room and wrote down what things looked like.
She put in her notice at Miami General with 4 weeks formal, 2 additional weeks offered, a transition that Diane called the most organized departure I've ever witnessed, with the expression of a woman who was sad and proud and trying not to be either. She sat with her mother in Fort Lauderdale for 2 weekends, proper weekends, with Sunday dinner and the full sensory catalogue of her childhood home, her mother's cooking and her mother's opinions, and the specific comfort of a place that had always been itself. She told her mother everything, or nearly everything, the 40 days, the hospital room, the voice she had given to the dark, what had grown from it. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then, "Your nonno was in the hospital once. When I was young. They didn't know if he would make it." She looked at her hands. "Your nonna sat with him every day and talked to him. About the tomatoes, about the neighbours, about everything and nothing. And when he came out, when he finally came out, he said to her, 'I knew you were there. I always knew.'" Chloe looked at her mother. "It's in the blood," her mother said. "This talking to people who need to hear." She left her apartment on a Saturday, which was the right day, her last farmer's market, one more walk along the bay, one more early evening at the Fig with a glass of wine and her notebook, writing the last entry in it, with the feeling of someone completing something that had always been meant to be complete. The last thing she wrote was, "Day 40 to now. I spoke into a well, and the well spoke back. And everything I said was true, and everything I got back was true. And this is, I think, what it looks like when you get it right. I'm going toward." She closed the notebook, put it in her bag, left a 20 on the table, walked out into the Miami evening. He was waiting at the airport. He was not supposed to be at the airport. She had told him she was capable of getting on a plane without an escort, and he had agreed, and she had been clear. But he was there, in the departures hall, in his dark coat, leaning against a pillar, with his hands in his pockets, and Dostoevsky's carrier at his feet, because Marco had, and she was going to have so many conversations with Marco. Marco had picked up the cat. She stopped walking when she saw him. He looked at her across the distance of the hall, the crowds moving around both of them, the airport doing its complicated dance of arrivals and departures, and he did not smile, not yet. He just looked at her, with the fullness of what she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he valued, completely, without performance. She crossed to him. "You weren't supposed to be here," she said. "I know." "Marco picked up Dostoevsky," he offered. "He is the worst," she said, which was entirely untrue, and both of them knew it. She looked at him. He looked at her. Dostoevsky, in his carrier, said something succinct. "Ready?" Raphael said. She thought about 40 days of speaking in the dark, about the Pantheon in the rain, about the lemon tree and the gardenias, and the argument about closed doors, and the morning in her kitchen with the mocha pot, and everything that had been given freely, without expectation, and had become this. All of this. "Yes," she said. He picked up Dostoevsky's carrier. She picked up her bag. They walked through the departures hall together, and the city fell away behind them, and ahead of them was Rome, the lemon tree, The apartment with the old walls, the morning light on the Trastevere cobblestones, and the long beginning of what they were. Rome in spring was a different animal from Rome in autumn. The light was longer and warmer, and the gardenias on the apartment terrace were in full bloom, ridiculous in their extravagance, their scent filling the courtyard in the evenings, so that the lemon tree presided over a small sea of perfume. The city moved differently in spring, faster, more alive, with a quality of emergence that was its own kind of celebration. She had been in Rome 4 months. 4 months, which was longer than the 40 days, and shorter than a lifetime, and exactly the right amount of time for something to begin to feel like home. She had a position at Ospedale Fate Bene Fratelli, which was on the Tiber Island in the middle of the river, an ancient hospital founded in the 1500s by a religious order that was also a modern trauma centre, and the commute across the river in the morning was something she had not yet gotten used to, in the sense of ceasing to notice it, which meant she was still paying the right kind of attention. Her Italian was improving. This was partly the city, and partly Raphael, who had the habit, charming and occasionally maddening, of answering her in Italian when she asked him things in English, which meant the conversations had a bilingual texture that she was coming to think of as its own kind of intimacy. 2 languages, 2 cities, 2 people who had started from an impossible place and arrived, somehow, here. They had a routine. This was the thing she had not expected, that the man who lived at the velocity he lived at would also be capable of routine, of the domestic texture that was the foundation of everything real. He woke early, always, and made the mocha-pot coffee, and was usually working by the time she came to the kitchen, but he put a cup out for her. He always put a cup out for her. The light being on. She had told him about that, in the hospital, thinking she was talking to the dark. He had heard, and he had, without ever saying so, made it something he did. The cup put out. The light in the hall when she came home late. The gardenias on every windowsill of every property, because he always had, and now she understood it differently. Not just his mother's garden, but invitation. The old instinct toward welcome, toward saying, "Someone is here, come in." She said this to him once, one of the terrace evenings, the Roman summer settling over the city, the lemon tree doing its ancient business below them. "You've always left the light on," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The gardenias. Everywhere you live. It's the same thing my father did, the light in the kitchen. A signal." She looked at the pot of white flowers on the railing. "Come in. Someone's here." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I never thought about it that way." "Maybe you didn't need to think about it. Maybe it's just what you are, underneath the rest of it." He looked at the gardenias, at the city below them, at her. "I never had someone to come home to," he said. "Not," he stopped, "not someone I wanted the light on for." She met his eyes. "It's on now," she said. He reached across and took her hand, held it. "Yes," he said, "it is." Marco came to Rome in May, which he did every month, and they had dinner, the 3 of them, at the trattoria in Testaccio that Raphael had been going to for 20 years, and that Marco had been going to with him for 15 of those. She had come to understand Marco. He was, underneath the loyalty and the organisation and the particular quality of the man who has given his life to another man's enterprise, deeply kind. Not sentimental, nothing so exposed as sentimental, but kind. Consistently, practically, in the way that manifested as coffee cups left at nurses' stations and cats collected from apartments and carefully accurate three-word text messages. "You look well," he told her, over the cacio e pepe that was, she had confirmed, the standard against which all other cacio e pepe would henceforth be judged. "I am well," she said. "Rome agrees with you. Rome and I have an understanding." Marco glanced at Raphael, and something passed between them in the way that things passed between people who had known each other for 30 years, a communication that used no words and required none. "She quotes the city now," Raphael said. "You spent years telling me the city had a personality," Marco said. "I did." "You were right." She looked between them, these two men, their 30 years, the particular weight of that history, and felt something she didn't quite have a name for. Belonging, maybe, or the beginning of it. She kept writing. The notebook she'd filled on her last night in Miami, she had on the bookshelf in the Trastevere apartment, among his books, between the Dante and the history of Cuba his father had given him. She'd started a new one. She wrote about the hospital and the patients and the Italian language and the way the Tiber smelled in the morning and the way the Forum looked in late afternoon light when the tourists had thinned and you could stand there and feel 2,000 years in your feet. She wrote about the lemon tree in all its seasonal iterations and about Dostoevsky's adjustment to Roman life. He had, characteristically, adapted immediately and was now conducting diplomatic relations with a neighbouring terrace cat named Augusto. She wrote about Raphael. Not the catalogue of him, not the 40-day reconstruction. She had that, and it lived in the sealed room that was the first notebook, and she kept it. She wrote about now. The cup put out. The almost smile that had become, over time, a real smile. Not frequent, but entirely his, entirely genuine, the kind that cost something. The arguments they had and resolved, not perfectly, but honestly. The way he said her name sometimes. Chloe. 2 syllables, in his voice that had 2 countries in it. With a weight that meant more than her name, that meant the specific, non-transferable, hard-won thing that was what they were to each other. She wrote, "I spent 40 days speaking to a man who couldn't answer, and in the answering, in everything that came after, I understood that all the years I thought I was protecting myself, I was just waiting. I was waiting for someone to hear. He heard, and now I'm home." In the fall, they went to Cuba, Raphael's first time. He was 42 years old, and he had never gone, and she sat beside him on the flight and watched him look out the window as Havana appeared below them, the green and blue of it, the strange, gorgeous dilapidation, the city that had been holding a version of his family history for 60 years. And she watched his face do something it almost never did, which was to be unprepared. She didn't say anything. She took his hand, and he held it with the specific pressure of a man who needed an anchor, and had one. They found the street his grandmother had photographed. It had a different name. The house was different, rebuilt, repainted, lived in by a family who did not know them, and whose children played in the doorway in the late afternoon heat. Raphael stood on the sidewalk across from it for a long time. She stood beside him and said nothing and let him have it, the way he had always let her have what she needed, in the way of people who understood that presence was not the same as words. Eventually he said quietly, "She said it was the most beautiful street in Havana." "It is," Chloe said. He looked at her. "It's beautiful," she said. "Your grandmother had good taste." He looked back at the house, at the children in the doorway, at the street that had changed its name and kept its bones. "Yes," he said, "she did." He brought gardenias back to Rome, white ones, from a market in old Havana that had been selling flowers since before the Revolution. He put them on every windowsill of the apartment in Trastevere, and the smell of them was everything. Was the hospital room, and the 40 days, and the Pantheon in the rain, and the kitchen in Coconut Grove, and the terrace above the lemon tree, and all the mornings and evenings, and difficult conversations and easy silences that had been the building of this specific, particular, impossible life. She stood in the Trastevere apartment in the October light, surrounded by the smell of gardenias, and thought about speaking into a well, about the voice that is a rope, about the things that grow better when they know someone is paying attention, about everything she'd said, thinking there were no consequences, about how wrong she'd been, about how glad she was. That evening he came home. She always knew the moment before the key in the door, always knew it was him from the particular quality of the footfall in the hallway. She had learned him the way you learned music, by repetition and attention. And she was in the kitchen with the mocha pot and the window open over the courtyard and the lemon tree doing its patient, permanent thing below. He came in and set his keys on the counter and stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, the way he sometimes did, looking at her in the ordinary light of the ordinary evening. Her, in his kitchen, with his coffee pot, in the city he loved, with the gardenias on the windowsill. And his face did the thing she had learned to read, and never tired of reading. The full, unguarded thing that he gave only here, only to her, in the private spaces where the armour was off. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face, both hands, the way he had done in the Pantheon's piazza in the rain, gentle and certain. And he kissed her once, briefly, with all the ordinary weight of a man who has somewhere to come home to and knows it. He put his forehead against hers. "Tell me something true," he said, what he always said when he came in. She thought about 40 days, about all the true things she had said into the dark, not knowing they had a destination. "The gardenias are blooming," she said. He smiled. "The real one. The one that cost something and gave it back." "Yes," he said, "they are." Outside, the lemon tree stood in the courtyard with its centuries, and the city went about its ancient, patient business, and in the window of the Trastevere apartment, the white gardenias opened in the October evening, and the light was on. It was always on now. She found the note on a Tuesday in November, 2 years after the 40 days. She was reorganizing the bookshelf. Dostoevsky had knocked 3 books off in the night, in what she was calling an artistic statement, and what Raphael was calling the cat is unmanageable. And the first notebook fell from between the Dante and the Cuba history and opened on the floor. She picked it up. Sat cross-legged on the floor in the morning light, in her pyjamas, and read. Day 23. He's still. The furrow is deeper tonight. She read it all the days, all the true things she had said into the dark. They had a different quality now, read forward. She had always looked back at them, But reading forward, she felt the arc of it, the movement, the way she had been building towards something she couldn't see from where she was standing. At the back of the notebook, she had not seen this, she was certain she had not done this. There was writing that was not hers. Small, precise, dark. A hand she would have recognized anywhere. She stared at it, looked up, looked at the bedroom door. He was standing in the doorway with coffee. He had always been an early riser. He watched her from the doorway with the particular quality of a man who has been waiting for something to happen and is now watching it happen, and she could not read his face. She looked back at the notebook. He had written in the space beneath her last entry of the 40 days, "I heard you. Every word, every day. I was never going to let you go. Ah." She sat on the floor of the Trastevere apartment with the notebook open in her hands and the October light coming through the windows and Dostoevsky walking across her legs with the complete indifference of an animal who has made his peace with all of this. She looked at Raphael Conti in the doorway with his coffee and his dark eyes and his voice that had 2 countries in it, and she thought about wells and ropes and voices and what grew in the space between 2 people who had, somehow, against all probability, found each other in the dark. "When did you write this?" she said. "The night before you came home," he said, "for the first time. The night I knew you were going to." "You were certain?" "I was," he considered, "hopeful. You were the one who told me there's a difference." She looked at the notebook, at the handwriting, at the 11 words that were the most precise, most honest, most Raphael thing he had ever said to her. "I was never going to let you go." "I know," she said. She stood up, crossed to him, took the coffee out of his hand and set it on the shelf, and stood close enough that the conversation stopped being anything other than what it was. "Good," she said. And the gardenias bloomed on the windowsill, and the lemon tree stood in the courtyard as it had stood for 2 centuries, and the city went on being Rome, which it had been doing for longer than anyone needed to count. And in the Trastevere apartment, with its rose-coloured walls and its book-lined shelves, and its 2 countries' worth of people, and 1 magnificently indifferent cat, the light was on. The light was always on.